Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have two great guests today. Marc Brettler is a member of the American Academy for Jewish Research and the Council of the Society of Biblical Literature. He's the Bernice and Morton Lerner Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University. He's also the Dora Golding Professor of Biblical Studies Emeritus and former chair of the Department of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University. He's also taught at Yale University, Brown University, Wellesley College, and Middlebury College. He's also taught in various adult Jewish education settings, including Wexner Heritage Program, the Innovative Me'ah Program in Boston, and he served as scholar-in-residence for the Foundation of Jewish Studies in Washington, D.C. He's actively involved in many aspects of Jewish communal life and has served on the board of Boston's Leventhal Sidman Jewish Community Center and Gann Academy, the new Jewish high school. Amy-Jill Levine, known as AJ, is Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. She's also a university professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, as well as the Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt. AJ's books include The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, Short Stories by Jesus, 6 children's books with S. Sasso, The Gospel of Luke with B. Witherington III, which is the first biblical commentary by a Jew and an evangelical. She's also the author of the Jewish Annotated New Testament and the Bible with and Without Jesus, co-written with Marc Brettler. She's also written a book called The Pharisees, co-edited with J. Sievers, 13 volumes of The Feminist Companions to the New Testament, and 7 New Testament Beginner's Guides. She's also the first Jew to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's also the recipient of both the Seelisberg Prize for Jewish-Christian Relations from the International Council of Christians and Jews and the H. Walter Award recipient for Reconciliation and Interfaith Cooperation from Archbishop of Canterbury. AJ is also an unorthodox member of an Orthodox synagogue and works to counter what she calls a harmful exegesis. Welcome, Marc and AJ. Thank you for coming.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah, let's start off just a brief background on both of you. So maybe, if you'd go first, AJ, tell me a bit about your background and how you got to become a professor and, why you study, New Testament and Jewish studies. Just a brief background on yourself.
I grew up in a neighborhood in Massachusetts that was primarily Roman Catholic, so I was interested in what my friends were doing. I got accused of killing God when I was 7, and I found that quite incomprehensible, so I started asking questions then, and I've continued to ask questions. When I went to graduate school at Duke, where Marc is now, although Marc was not there then, the dean of the divinity school would not allow me into the New Testament classroom because I'm not a Christian. So he said, well, you go teach Old Testament as a teaching assistant. And I said, I don't do Old Testament. And he said, you do now. So I figured in order to be ahead of the class, I'd better do all the PhD courses in Old Testament as well as New, and then found out that I really needed rabbinic literature in order to fill in the gaps, both for New Testament studies and for Old Testament or Tanakh interpretation. And that's how I became a professor of New Testament and Jewish studies.
Well, interesting. I'm sorry you experienced such a essentially anti-Semitism your whole life. It's crazy.
But it got me a pretty good job in the long run. And now my job seems to be, disabusing people of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic stereotypes.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the rabbinic literature shortly, but if we could just talk to Marc for a moment. And Marc, can you give us a brief background on yourself? And then I'll go back to AJ.
Sure. My story is pretty much the total opposite of AJ's, which is why we write so many things together, because we complement each other in a variety of ways. I grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. I went to Jewish day school through high school, though I was studying the Bible in Hebrew in elementary school. Though honestly, I thought I'd had enough by the time I had finished high school. And my first year in college in 1975, I needed another course. And somebody said that there's this guy, Nachum Sarna, who is teaching a course in Psalms, which was his expertise. They said it would be an interesting course. I took it. I found it very, very interesting, engaging in a way in which Jewish texts had not been previously engaging. And I really never looked back. And I ended up being a major in Near Eastern and Judaic studies instead of economics. I continued at Brandeis, studied a little at Hebrew University, and have been teaching more or less since 1982, primarily doing Hebrew Bible or Tanakh.
Oh, wow. Okay. And AJ, so you mentioned rabbinic literature. For those that don't know, what is rabbinic literature and how does it fit into Old and New Testament studies?
It's post-biblical for the Bibles of both the church and the synagogue. The earliest rabbinic source we have is called the Mishnah, and that was written down somewhere around the year 200, 220, but it contains much, much earlier material. And then we have the Tosefta, which is the additions to the Mishnah. And then we have the Talmud, which is kind of a gloss on the Mishnah by bringing in the Tanakh. And we have other midrashic material like Genesis Rabbah or Deuteronomy Rabbah. So rabbinic literature dates from about 200 going up, 800, maybe even 900, depending upon when people want to date this material. And much of it is commentary on the biblical text, the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. And some of it is social history, and some of it is rabbis arguing with each other over legal principles. But in order to get a fulsome idea of what first century Jews are doing, and that means Jews like Jesus and Paul, rabbinic literature, when used carefully, granted it's later, but there are earlier materials, rabbinic literature, when used carefully, can help us get a little bit more purchase on the time period. And more important, for well over a century now, some Christian scholars have been using select passage from the rabbis to make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good. So it helps to know what they're citing, and generally when Christians tend to cite a negative rabbinic passage, the very next line is the complete opposite of what that statement is. So I can use rabbinic literature in part to correct Christian misunderstandings of the New Testament.
Yeah, why did the start of rabbinic literature happen only in the 200s? Why wouldn't it have happened hundreds of years earlier?
It's a matter of deciding when finally to codify all this material. And the consensus, although it's a little fuzzy, is that a fellow named Rabbi Judah, known as Judah HaNasi or Judah the Prince, had the wherewithal and the economic ability to commit all this material to writing. And sometime in the 1st and 2nd and early 3rd centuries, that's when people started collecting things, like collecting the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, or collecting the fables of Aesop, or collecting the great statements of the Stoics. So part of it was the thing to do, and part of it was the need to have some sort of guidance following the destruction of the temple, following the dispersal, following the year 135 of Jews from the city of Jerusalem. What does it mean to live when you're not in your capital, when you might be outside the land, when you have a defunct priesthood because there's no temple where the priest could engage in worship of God? What does it mean to be a Jew, and how do you hold on to your materials in dispersion? And rabbinic literature managed to be that cohesive force that allowed people to continue to function, understand who they are, and then move on. We might compare the Constitution of the United States.
Yeah, well, question maybe from Marc's perspective, from what I understand, Hebrew, I mean, a lot of people would call it a dead language, I guess, until Eliezer ben Yehuda brought it back. But was it really, I guess it wasn't really dead, but where was it used and how was it used, from the destruction of the temple through when it was brought back in the 1800s? What does that look like?
Hebrew did not die with the destruction of the temple. And in fact, in the late period of the Second Temple, many people living in the land of Israel then spoke different languages, most people not all three. Hebrew was used, Aramaic was used, Greek was used, and Hebrew continued to be used after the destruction of the temple. So, for example, one of the surprises is a result of excavations when the letters of Bar Kokhba were discovered. And that's what AJ was referring to concerning the rebellion in the years 132 to 135. To people's great surprise, some of those letters were in Hebrew. So that indicated that Hebrew was still spoken then. And some people thought that, for example, rabbinic texts were written totally in a dead language. But it's likely that Hebrew was still spoken or used. People in the medieval period wrote commentary literature in Hebrew. The most famous commentary is by Rashi, who lived in what is now France from 1040 to 1105. That is written in beautiful Hebrew. About a century later, Maimonides is writing in beautiful Hebrew. So Hebrew did not really exist by and large as a spoken language a few centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple, but it certainly was used liturgically, and many Jews were able to understand it. And indeed, quite a few learned Jews were able to write in it. And people even suggest that one of the advantages that some Jews had in the Middle Ages and the early modern period in terms of commerce is that even though they were coming from very disparate places, they could not really speak to each other in their vernacular languages. They could use some sort of Hebrew to communicate with one another. So the notion that Hebrew totally died out is not quite a correct notion.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
So what happened at the time of Ben Yehuda then? Did he faithfully look at the existing Hebrew up until that time and just tweaked it a little bit? Or did he go with the narrative like, oh, it's dead, so I'm going to remake it in whatever image I want it to be?
No, he wasn't trying to remake Hebrew. So if you're talking about modern Hebrew is largely the vocabulary of biblical Hebrew, using a lot of the grammar of rabbinic Hebrew. And one thing that Ben Yehuda insisted on is that with the rise of nationalism, in the same way that other people's languages and nations have languages, the nascent state or the hoped-for state should have a language, and that was part of his insistence on Hebrew. And so much of what he did was to establish new words that were needed as a result of changed technology. I mean, so for example, certainly the Bible or rabbinic literature had no word for telephone. And Ben Yehuda is responsible for creating many of these new words and also helping to create a Hebrew language academy. I mean, people who live in Europe are used to such academies. The United States does not have one, but this academy would ultimately help to create new words so that Hebrew could really be an everyday spoken language. And I'm sitting here at my desk. Certainly at the time of Ben Yehuda, there was no good biblical or rabbinic word for paperclip. Okay? So all sorts of words needed to be created. And he was a genius at it, often finding obscure words in biblical or rabbinic literature or creating his own words.
So what did it take for both of you to be able to read the old rabbinic texts and the Old Testament natively? I mean, did you both go in knowing modern Hebrew and then you had to take additional classes in ancient Hebrew, or was it a pretty easy transition for you both?
Well, it would have been easier for Marc than for me because Marc grew up in an environment where day-to-day in the classroom one would have Hebrew instruction. I did not. So I, like a good conservative Jew, went to Hebrew school 2 days a week after school. where I sort of paid attention, but I only started formally studying Hebrew when I got to college and then in graduate school, and I did biblical Hebrew, and then I did courses in rabbinic Hebrew, and I've never lived in Israel long enough to pick up Ivrit, so when I go to Israel, I work in English, because my modern Hebrew is very, very halting.
What is rabbinic Hebrew versus biblical Hebrew?
We have changes in vocabulary because we're talking about new issues. Much of rabbinic Hebrew is legal material. So similarly to any average, United States citizen, if we pick up law codes or we look at a contract, there's stuff that people who do not have formal legal education may not be able to follow when you start with the party of the first part. So one needs to know the legal shorthand that the rabbis in which the rabbis will frequently engage. The rabbis also, depending upon the text that we're looking at, make lots of allusions to the Tanakh, so unless you know the Tanakh really, really well, you're going to miss a lot of those allusions.
And I'll also say all languages naturally evolve. So the Hebrew from the latest parts of the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, let's say the Book of Chronicles or the Hebrew parts of the Book of Daniel, are very, very different in terms of vocabulary and grammatical structure than the very earliest Hebrew in the Bible, which might be something like Judges chapter 5. There may be close to 1,000-year difference between those two. So languages naturally evolve. That certainly is the case of English. That is why so many people find it so difficult to read Shakespeare and perhaps impossible to read Chaucer unless they're given some direction. And in addition to that, Hebrew is always influenced by languages that it came into contact with. So, for example, in the rabbinic period, the major newer language it came into contact with is Greek, and there are many loanwords from Greek that have been assimilated into rabbinic Hebrew. You already see this in the book of Daniel from the 2nd century, where you have the word symphonia, which is cognate to the English word symphony, though in Daniel probably means a type of musical instrument like bagpipes. You have in rabbinic texts the word zug for a pair, which some listeners might recognize in the biological term zygote. The term for a custodian in rabbinic Hebrew is an apotropos, which is a straight borrowing from Greek. The word for robbers in rabbinic Hebrew is taken from Greek. Well, when languages are in contact, languages inevitably change.
My favorite is aporos, which is a good Hebrew word, but it comes from the Greek Epicurean, and that actually found its way from Hebrew into Yiddish.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, right, Yiddish, Ladino, there's a few, I guess, amalgamations of Hebrew with other languages. Which ones are you guys aware of, and, what are their names, if any come to mind? What are some examples?
Hey, I work in biblical studies. I stop pretty much when Constantine comes in. So my focus tends to be in Greek, which is the New Testament, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of what eventually became the Tanakh, plus a bunch of other stuff that Jews wrote in Greek that did not make it into the Jewish canon. I work in Aramaic, and when I was in graduate school, I was also working in Syriac and Coptic. But my first job was at a 4-year liberal arts college where I had to be all things to all people, and my Syriac and my Coptic kind of went away.
Understand.
So there are many Jewish languages. People might even argue that, at least in certain places with large Jewish populations, there's a special dialect of English. And I've discovered this, having grown up in Brooklyn. You're trying to use certain words in North Carolina, where those words may come from Yiddish, such as the word schlep, and my students had no clue what I was talking about. And most of the Jewish languages are, by and large, other languages which are written in the Hebrew script or some form of a Hebrew script. And they will occasionally contain Hebrew loanwords in them. So, for example, lots of very important commentary was written in the Middle Ages in a language called Judeo-Arabic. That is what Maimonides wrote many of his works in. And that is a dialect of Arabic that is written in Hebrew script.
Oh, wow. Last question about this, if it's okay, Mark. Which language or languages are most closely intermingled with Hebrew? Was it Greek? Was it Aramaic or something else?
I don't know what you mean by intermingled. If you mean which has the largest loan words in Hebrew, I'm actually not sure. It's a good question. I didn't quite know how to quantify that. And if you want
I'm not sure either. But
if you want to talk about influence of languages, of course, it's not only in loanwords, but it's also in grammatical forms. And there certainly Aramaic had much more of an influence on the structure of Hebrew than Greek is, especially because Hebrew and Aramaic are so very close. And more recently, many of the European languages have very much influenced modern Hebrew, to the extent that some people have claimed that the syntax of modern Hebrew almost makes it into a European language.
Huh. Very interesting. All right, going back to another topic that would be more, I guess, in AJ's wheelhouse. You said that you had a lot of problems, I guess, from Christians saying, oh, you killed God. And like you said, they would quote passages or select passages from rabbinic writings and other writings. And then if you kept reading further, there would be a clarification, let's say, or a change of meaning that would undo the original meaning. Are there any examples of passages, AJ, that you found that, if quoted wrongly, give a completely different meaning from, if giving a more complete quote in regards to Jesus and, New Testament?
Right. So when I was a kid, I rarely heard things that were anti-Semitic, by the way, other than one little girl on the school bus with an idea of deicide. But I did find it in academics, and I did hear it in church sermons when I would go to services with my friends when I was in college and graduate school. And the priest or the pastor would say something like, well, the Jews think X, but of course, we Christians think Y. So very common. For example, that Jews are interested in an eye for an eye and Christians are interested in turning the other cheek. But if we go to rabbinic references to the eye for an eye passages, the rabbis make it abundantly clear that it's a legal principle. It cannot be practiced literally because no two eyes are alike. And as one rabbi put it, if I put out your eye but I'm blind, it wouldn't make any difference if you put out my eye. So the rabbis work out a formula for loss of work due to injury, pain, medical expenses, and embarrassment in case of actual physical damage. Jesus here simply changes the subject because there's a big difference between getting slapped on the cheek and losing a limb. Or some Christians will say, well, the rabbis say, or the Jews say, that a man can divorce his wife for any reason, and consequently, the explanation for Jesus forbidding divorce, as he does in Mark and Luke, Matthew has a loophole, is to protect women's rights. But if you look at the Mishnah, Tractate 18, which is the divorce tractate, where there are a few rabbis who say, you can divorce her if she burns your dinner, or if you find somebody who's prettier. In the very same tractate, in the next verse, there are other rabbis who say things like, you can only divorce in cases of adultery. So what happens with Christian scholars to this day is frequently there's a cherry picking of rabbinic literature to find the one text that they can juxtapose to something in the New Testament. And that one text is usually a negative, very often from a rabbinic source that might date to the year 300 or 400, retrojected back into the first century. And then ignoring the rabbinic context, which gives alternative explanations, which sound very, very much like what we have in the New Testament.
And I just add that the same cherry picking is there with some theologians and some preachers in reference to the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible as well, where it is easy to find verses in which God appears as angry in the Hebrew Bible. But there are many verses there which talk about God's chesed or loving kindness. And conversely, it's very easy to find certain references in the New Testament, most especially, but not only in the book of Revelation, that depict God as very angry. So it's really, really important not to overgeneralize and to really see the complexity of both of these great traditions and not to essentialize them by saying Judaism or all Jews say, or Christianity and all Christians say.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know, but it seems like Christians are more, I guess, careful to say, okay, this is canon, this is biblical, this is not. Jews, it seems like, I don't know, because there's all this rabbinic literature, et cetera, that, the Tanakh is it held like in a higher regard than rabbinic literature, or are they looked at equally? Like in terms of authority, in terms of what you should do, what you shouldn't do, how are the different sources of literature looked at?
You've got a misperception in terms of how you've just generalized across the Christian spectrum. If you're looking at certain Protestant groups, then everything is the Bible text, and you don't put anything on top of that. You don't gild it. But if you're looking at the Roman Catholic tradition or various branches of Eastern Orthodoxy, there's an ongoing tradition beyond the canon. So just as Jews would look to rabbinic literature to understand how to read the Tanakh, so people in these more Catholic, small c traditions would look not only to the Bible, their Old Testament and New Testament, but also to church teaching over the centuries to determine how to understand those particular texts. So even when we talk about Christians, we have to talk about what particular Christian we're talking about. Similarly to when we talk about Jews, it makes a difference whether I'm talking to somebody who's a humanistic rabbi or somebody who's a member of the Haredim.
Yeah, and you know, and what AJ said is very important. You have the same sort of variety within Judaism, with different groups giving different levels of importance to the rabbinic law. I don't think anybody would say that rabbinic law is more important than the Bible within Judaism. People would say, or some people would say, this is a big dividing point within different Jewish groups, would say that certain rabbinic interpretations are the authoritative eyes through which we need to see and understand the biblical text. But it is certainly not replacing the Bible, because indeed, in the same way that the New Testament cannot be understood without the Old Testament, certainly rabbinic literature cannot be understood without the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible.
Or to flip that, we can't understand in any sort of unified way how to carry out the various commandments, whether positive injunctions, thou shalt, and the negative injunctions, thou shalt not, unless we have some guideline that helps us with that. So the text is very clear. We're supposed to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, and we can work for 6 days, but on the seventh day, we're not supposed to work. But it's rabbinic literature that helps us determine what constitutes work, because otherwise everybody's doing their own thing, and then you have no community. You have a bunch of individuals.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Thanks for the perspective on it. I appreciate it. I guess another perspective question. So, you can't say how do the Jews perceive the New Testament, but what are some ways that, people of Jewish faith perceive the New Testament that you've seen? Both of you?
Well, I wouldn't even talk about a Jewish faith. I'd have to go back and say it's just Jews. I think we're not just all a faith community, and there are lots of Jews who don't have any faith in the sense of a theology, but they're pretty certain they're Jews. And the spectrum is entirely broad. Some look at it, and I would count myself among them, as the New Testament gives me insight into Jewish history, and I think that's very helpful. I mean, we Jews were very good up until the Maccabees, and then boom, we're in the Mishnah. So if I want to know something about first century Judaism, the New Testament is one of my better sources. It helps me understand where some anti-Semitism came from, and it's always good to know where it came from, and then even more to know the historical background and the literary context. So if someone cites the text in an anti-Semitic way, we have some way of responding to that. And finally, at least for me, I want Christians to know more about Jews than, stereotypes of the book of Leviticus, which is actually a pretty decent book. A traveling production of Fiddler on the Roof and whatever's happening in Gaza. I want them to know about my history and my traditions and my values and my texts. And if I want Christians to know that about Jews who are their neighbors, then I think we Jews, particularly living in Christian society, broader Christian society, owe Christians the same courtesy, which means knowing something about their texts rather than just stereotypes, and then knowing something about how they've interpreted those texts over time.
Yeah. And to pick up on that, many Jews really do not know the New Testament at all.
Many Christians don't either, actually.
I think that Jews know it less. That the average Jew knows the New Testament much less than the average Christian, I believe. And a lot of what AJ and I have tried to do, for the reasons that he just elaborated upon and others, we feel that this really needs to be corrected. And that is why we've worked together on the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is a work with totally Jewish contributors, so that Jews should feel more comfortable reading the New Testament, knowing that they are not reading a book on the New Testament, which is trying to convert them. And that's also why we worked on the book, The Bible With and Without Jesus, which can give different people a sense of both what the Hebrew Bible is about and what the New Testament is about, and similarities and differences concerning how the two communities interpret both of those books.
So any examples from your annotated book? It sounds very interesting. What kind of important things did you put in there in this annotation?
The Jewish Annotated has Jews providing introductions and then notes to the text of every single book in the New Testament, and plus over 30 back essays ranging from how was Jewish law understood in various ways in the first century, to how did the Romans get into the country in the first place, to how did the Rabbinic literature and medieval Jewish literature and modern Jewish literature and thinkers understand Jesus and Paul and Judas Iscariot and the Virgin Mary. So to explain to Jews in a back essay what's baptism and what is Eucharist or communion, and to explain to Christians, here's how Jesus fit and Paul fit so entirely well within their first century Jewish context in terms of how they understand the role of Gentiles, how they understand debates over how best to fulfill what God wants, which means understanding Torah, to their relationships with women, to their relationships with the Roman state.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and pretty much every page of the notes of the Jewish Annotated New Testament brings cases, sometimes from Rabbinic literature, which, as AJ noted, is all later than the New Testament, but sometimes preserves earlier tradition, or from Josephus or Philo, who are much closer or contemporaneous with,
or the Dead Sea Scrolls,
or the Dead Sea Scrolls, contemporaneous with either the figures in the New Testament or the authors of the New Testament, and thus it contextualizes that information. The New Testament was not written as a Christian book. That term barely existed at that point. It really is a Jewish book, and we provide lots of parallels which would allow somebody to understand what was in the background of the people who were writing it and were reading it. And we think that that allows for a much richer reading, a reading within its proper historical time.
Right. And
that sounds like it. Yeah.
One other thing that's really important here is when we know where Christian preaching and teaching is going to move into anti-Semitic interpretation, we pull out little gray boxes, in effect, like, you may have heard, but don't go there. Go here for the following reasons. Here's why this anti-Semitic reading is wrong, and here's what you can say instead.
Any particular one that jumps to mind that you could expand on a little bit?
All of the debates that Jesus has with his fellow Jews regarding how to follow Torah, where for many Christians, the idea of the Sabbath is for Jews like a straitjacket, and it's something horrible. And Jews are so worried about working that they're all sanctimonious and neurotic. And then Jesus invents, love God, love neighbor, everything is fine. As opposed to showing how Jesus actually makes the law more rigorous rather than less. So when I hear from my students that Jews, it's just so hard to follow the law, I say, okay, fine. What Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount is what Rabbinic Judaism calls building a fence about the law. The law says don't murder. Jesus says don't be angry. Because if you're not angry, you're less likely to murder. But it's a whole lot harder not to be angry. The law says don't commit adultery. Jesus says don't think about it. That's harder. But if you don't think about it, you don't plan it. And if you don't plan it, you're less likely to do it. So we are looking at Jesus not making the law light, but actually kind of topping it off, or what he would say, to fulfill it, to show it in its fullest perspective on how best to carry it out.
Well, let me give another example. I just happened to open the book to it. So John 8:44 famously calls the Jews, which is really a quite problematic phrase that you have, especially in the book of John, children of the devil. So there we explain the phrase. We say, quote, some scholars attempt to excuse this language and so forth, but we say that that's soft-pedaling, which is not okay. And we conclude by that little sidebar by saying the verse has played a major role in the history of anti-Semitism. We think it's really important to call attention to those verses, which have been very problematic. In some cases, we offer historical reasons that explain why that very hurtful language was used. But it's a very central part of this book to make people aware of this language, and that they have to try to avoid using it in contemporary discourse.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So the name of the book that you guys wrote, and where is it available? Let's state that and restate it.
So the Jewish Annotated New Testament, many bookstores, online, etc., published by Oxford University Press. You certainly want to get the second edition, which is much more expansive than the first edition.
Right, so that's 2017. You can, by the way, get it in German, Italian, and as of this coming August, in Dutch.
Very interesting. Yeah, so that's great.
National value. And the other book that we've discussed just briefly is The Bible With and Without Jesus, How Jews and Christians Tell the Same Stories Differently.
Have you interacted with, Christians that have gone through your books and your material? And if so, did they get any interesting insights, or were they changed by reading it?
The letters are consistent. They are overwhelmingly positive. Sometimes I'll get notes from, you could have talked about this also, or why didn't you talk about this? And will you do a second edition, or will you do a third edition, or will you do another Bible With and Without Jesus with different stories? So at least the people who are writing to me show enormous appreciation. And what's particularly helpful is when I hear from priests and pastors saying, I keep a copy of the Jewish Annotated on my desk, and I always consult it when I am preparing my sermons or my Bible studies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I'll also say that in March 2019, AJ and I were in Rome together, and we had the opportunity to present a copy of the Jewish Annotated New Testament to the Pope. And it was quite a moving experience, as you might imagine. And he said to his assistant, this is a very important book. Please put it somewhere where I can find it. So the book really is being used by a wide variety of people throughout all of the Christian denominations. And look, books like this do not make a difference overnight, but incrementally, I think it's starting to change some of the attitudes.
What's particularly impressive for me is when the German translation came out, the Protestant bishops of Bavaria and Franconia, and if you're not exactly sure where that is, think the area around Munich, Protestant bishops gave every single minister under their control a copy of the German translation and said, here, use that.
Wow. So I guess the consensus is that it gives a much richer ability for, a priest or pastor to give their sermons. They have much more context now.
They have more,
give it a...
Right. And it is like a prophylactic. They know what not to say.
And do you feel like this is has the potential to bring a lot of Jews and Christians together?
It already has. Some extent.
Yeah, it has. We hope so. We also recognize that in many countries, including in the United States, there are many families which have one parent who is a Jewish, one parent who is Christian. And this also becomes a text which they could look at and appreciate together. And we're quite happy about the ability of this book to do that.
Years ago, when we did the first edition, I did some public talk on this. And a rabbi said to me during this kind of Q&A that you do after your presentation, he said, well, I think it's much more important that Jews read our own sources rather than read the New Testament. And there was somebody else who just stood up and said, I'm reading my own sources now because of the Jewish Annotated. I wanted to go back and know my own material better. So even there, reading the New Testament actually makes me a better Jew because I have a better sense of my own Jewish history and a better sense of the way the halakha, somewhat anachronistic term, but the law had been understood at the time. So in knowing more about Christianity, I actually learned more about Judaism and appreciate Judaism even more. And that's probably another partial effect of the Jewish Annotated. We Jews know our own history better.
Yeah, we're living in such an either-or world, which both AJ and I think is not so good. So we're hoping that through our publications, people can really be more open to understanding different perspectives. We're not trying to convert anybody to anything, but we think that this mutual understanding is crucial for us working together in a civil society.
So right. At the end of the day, the Jew might say to the Christian, well, I don't agree with this particular teaching, but I can see where you get it. And that is so important. So you can understand the logic and you can understand the different choices people make when they come to their own interpretation.
Yes. So
it should help both ways. Yeah, both sides.
Yes, I'd say both in the Jewish Annotated New Testament and in the Bible With and Without Jesus. We get comments, especially from Christians, concerning Jews. I never understood why you don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And they'll be phrased in many, many different ways. And one of the results of these books is that people now do understand why that is possible. And again, we're not trying to claim that one reading is absolutely right for everybody. AJ and I have our own religious commitments, but we really do want, for example, Jews to understand how the Hebrew Bible, or in this case, really the Old Testament, is used within the Christian community to promote certain understandings of Jesus as the Christus or as the Messiah. And in the same way, we want Christians to understand that these very same verses, which are read in a particular way in the New Testament, can be read and have been read very differently in Judaism. So that's a lot of what we're really trying to do in these two books.
The last question, I would doubt that you guys just have stopped. So what new stuff are you working on, both?
We're right now working on the third edition of the Jewish Annotated. So there's a new translation by the National Council of Churches, to which we have to adopt and adapt. We have changed out some of our authors. In some cases, we've doubled up, taking an older commentary, and then added a new author to gloss that. In some cases, completely new contributors. We've more internationalized our list of contributors, particularly in the German-speaking world and in the Hebrew-speaking world. And we're updating. So the last edition was published in 2017. This will be published, God willing, in 2025. And it's a lot of work.
I'm sure it is, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say to that, as people have read the book and commented to us, a big chunk of the book are the essays. And we've added quite a few new essays to this edition. And some people work really, really well by reading a text and a commentary. Other people enter into literature not by reading it, but by reading about it. So we'll have a new essay on sin, a new essay on Judas. We have an essay on certain Christian stereotypes of the Old Testament. So a whole lot of new material, but people need to be patient.
Last question. What do you consider, and do you use like what's called the pseudepigrapha or the Apocrypha or these other books of the Bible that, are not necessarily considered canon by all Christians? Are they useful? Have you used them in any of your commentary?
Absolutely. It's really hard to understand first century Judaism unless you understand the Maccabees, and you can't just go to the rabbinic comments about the Maccabees, which is not terribly militaristic, but it's got a great miracle. It really helps to know what's in 1st, 2nd, and 4th Maccabees. We look at other Jewish apocalyptic literature like 4th Ezra, 1st Enoch, 2nd Enoch, 2nd Baruch, to help us understand texts like Daniel as well as the book of Revelation in the New Testament. We look at depictions of women for which the so-called deuterocanonical materials, the Jewish stuff written in Greek that's canonical for the Catholic churches, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican. Judith, Susanna, the character of Sarah in the Book of Tobit, to get a sense of women's lives, representations, and roles. So absolutely, we're looking at what are typically called Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, along with Josephus and Philo and the Dead Sea Scrolls and contemporary Roman sources, and archaeological work and rabbinic literature, anything we can get a handle on that may help us gain more insight into the New Testament text, particularly that text in its broader Jewish environment.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for coming. This has been a really great call, and I definitely encourage listeners to check into your two books and to look out for the third edition that'll be coming, at some point in the next year or so, hopefully.
Happy to talk with you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.